Hello everyone, Benji-Sales here, and I'm here today to talk to you about the absolutely incredible record-breaking performance from Sony and PlayStation in Q1 of this year. Now, Sony had been forecasting that they were going to ship 19 million PlayStation 5 consoles this fiscal year, and that was starting to look highly questionable coming out of the holiday sales period. Not that the holiday sales weren't impressive, but they needed to ship so many consoles in Q1 to hit that 19 million forecast that it would have to be the biggest Q1 in the entire history of the video game industry for any platform. So it was starting to look, how are they going to actually be able to put this off? They would need to ship 6.2 million units in order to hit that. That caused a lot of doubt, including from myself early on. Back in like January-ish period, I was thinking, man, I'm not sure that they're going to be able to hit this. 6.2 million in January through March? How are they going to be able to pull this off? I'm not so sure about that. Well, guys, the numbers are in, and wow. Not only did they manage to hit 6.2 million shipped, guys, they did one better. That is right. They shipped 6.3 million PlayStation 5s in January through March. Absolutely stunning. And that brings them to 19.1 million for the fiscal year. PlayStation 5 just shipped more consoles in January through March than the Switch has done at its peak, than the Wii has done at its peak, than what PlayStation 2 or what PlayStation 4 did at their peaks. That's right, the biggest Q1 ever. Simply incredible. Now today, guys, I'm going to go through some slides, I'm going to go through some tweets, and I'm going to break down the PlayStation performance for you, both for Q1 of the calendar year as well as their fiscal year. Now, just to clear one thing up, because you might get a little confused whenever I'm talking about this stuff or looking at the slides, keep in mind, guys, that it's Q1, no matter what I say, it's Q1 of the calendar year we're discussing here. For Sony, it's Q4 of their fiscal year. So that makes things a little bit weird. It's like, wait, Q4, Q1, Benji, I'm lost here. Just keep in mind, no matter what I say, that we're talking January through March. It just gets a little weird comparing fiscal years and calendar years. So first of all, in regards to hardware, like I had mentioned, 6.3 million PS5 shipped in Q4. That's compared to 2 million in Q4 of last year. So they were up by 3 times this quarter. For the fiscal year, it's 11.5 million last year to 19.1 million. Huge growth in regards to hardware. Software had some slight declines. For Q4, it was 70.5 million last year compared to 68 million this year. So you did see software come down a bit. First party titles went from 14.5 million last year to 9.5 million in this quarter. So some declines there. Full game software digital ratio was actually basically flat, both for the quarter as well as for the fiscal year. It was 71% in Q4 last year and 66% for the fiscal, compared to 70% in Q4 and 67% for the fiscal. So essentially flat in both. It was just like a 1% change either way. That's like a rounding error. It was essentially flat. Now, in terms of overall users and subscribers, PlayStation 4 Plus, or not PlayStation 4, I apologize, PlayStation Plus was completely flat. It was 47.4 million in Q4 compared to 47.4 million last Q4. That might be seen on the surface as slightly disappointing. You'd want to see subscriber growth, but actually I would say this isn't a hugely positive, but it's also kind of okay, because if you look at Q3, they actually had been declining. So Q3 of last year, they were at 48 million PlayStation Plus subscribers, and in Q3 of this year, they were at 46.4 million. So they went from declining to actually being flat. So it's actually a win, I would say. Not a huge win, not something worth like, popping champagne bottles and celebrating about, but at least that decline that they had been on, that decline that they were seeing, that is now flattened out, which is, pretty good news overall. In terms of monthly active users, they actually did have a little bit of growth here. So in Q4 of last year, they were at 106 million monthly active users. In Q4 of this year, they were at 108 million. So a gain of 2 million monthly active users year over year. That's definitely a good thing to see for Sony. Now, this next slide is going to have some additional information for you. In terms of looking at their fiscal year 2022 as a whole, the positives for them, they had a positive impact on foreign exchange rates. They had a positive impact on the increase in sales of hardware, which we noted, that huge jump from 11.5 million to 19.1 million. An increase in sales of first-party titles was a positive for them. The only real negative for their last fiscal year was they did see a decrease in sales of non-first-party titles, including add-on content. So what that means, third-party game sales and DLC was down year over year, and that was really their only big negative they had to note because of the positives from things like hardware and first-party sales. Now, looking ahead at this next fiscal year, their forecasts, the main positive is they're expecting an increase in sales of hardware and peripheral devices. I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on that in just a second. And the big negative that I'm seeing get a lot of discussion online is Sony has noted an impact of decrease in sales of first-party titles. And I've seen a lot of discussion, hey, how is that going to be possible with Spider-Man 2 right around the corner? Aren't we all expecting this to be some sort of juggernaut, incredible performance? Is Sony maybe thinking it's not going to do as well as the rest of us are? No, I don't interpret it that way at all. I think the main thing we're looking at here is probably Sony's just going to have less first-party content as a whole than what they had over the previous period. Last year, they had God of War Ragnarok, which, as we know, fastest selling PlayStation exclusive ever. They had The Last of Us Part 1, which did pretty okay out of the gate, but then saw a big surge with The Last of Us TV series. They had legs of Gran Turismo 7, as well as Horizon Forbidden West, which Horizon Forbidden West launched before the fiscal year, right? That launched in February. However, you still had all those legs of the entire year of Horizon Forbidden West sales bundled into that as well. Right now, the only big AAA first-party PlayStation game we know of hitting this fiscal year is Spider-Man 2. Now, I suspect they probably have something else there as well. I'd be a little surprised if Spider-Man 2 is the only thing planned for this fiscal year, but it's probably not a lot, right? It's probably maybe one more, whereas last year, you had multiple of them, as well as those big legs of Horizon, which we saw in charts fairly regularly. This time around, it's probably going to be Spider-Man 2 and maybe like one other big exclusive. Another thing that could be a factor here is possibly it's going to be maybe some free-to-play launches for multiplayer games. That's definitely possible. And keep in mind, free-to-play titles, it's all about that consistent games as a service revenue you get over time with them, not so much the explosive day one and week one sales you'll see of like a $70 game, right? If you're going to sell millions of units day one at $70, that's a colossal ton of revenue pouring in compared to maybe a free-to-play title that has that super low barrier of entry, and maybe you're getting a ton of players in the gate right off the bat, but you might not be getting as much pure revenue right off the bat. It's more about the legs of that revenue over time. So those are the kind of things I'm thinking. I don't think it's like, hey, Spider-Man 2 is going to maybe underperform and Sony expects it to be like so much smaller than God of War. I think it's just maybe a little less first-party content as well as maybe some free-to-play launches. Some people are going to bring up games like Final Fantasy 16. They're going to say, Benji, you keep saying Spider-Man 2. What about Final Fantasy 16, right? This is a huge exclusive for PlayStation. It is. It's not a first-party game, so that would not be wrapped up in their forecast here of first-party. It's an exclusive title. However, it is made by Square Enix. That is a Square Enix, so it is actually considered a third-party title. It is not a first-party PlayStation game, despite being exclusive. So keep that in mind. Now, I mentioned that there was another thing I was going to dive into on this forecast, and I said, hey, don't worry, I'm going to go a little bit more into hardware. And that's because Sony is now forecasting that they're going to ship 25 million PlayStation 5 consoles this fiscal year. If they happen to pull that off, guys, that's going to be the biggest single year for any PlayStation console ever. That's right, it's going to be bigger than the PlayStation 2 was at its all-time peak. It's going to be bigger than the PlayStation 4 was at its all-time peak. And we know how successful those platforms were. Sony thinks PlayStation 5 is about to have a bigger year than either of those in terms of hardware, and that's a gain of 6 million units year over year, right? Because they were at 19.1 last year. Now we're looking at 25 million plus. So they think we're going to have the biggest year in the history of the PlayStation brand for hardware, and we're also going to go up by 6 million units year over year. Now, some might be questioning, Benji, weren't you just talking about less first-party games? How is it possible that they're going to go way up in hardware if they're not going to have maybe as many big first-party games as they had last year? Well, there's a couple things you want to keep in mind on this forecast. First of all, Sony did still have extensive shortages for multiple quarters last year. It wasn't really until the holiday season and into Q1 that you saw that huge surge of inventory come in. So there was multiple quarters last year that the PlayStation 5 was still extremely supply constrained. Sony's probably expecting that for the first couple quarters of this fiscal year, they'll just be naturally up anyways because they're going to have more hardware just sitting available on shelves for people to actually buy. So that's one thing you have to keep in mind. Another is, of course, Spider-Man 2 is going to move a ton of hardware. It is a current gen exclusive, whereas games like God of War Ragnarok and Horizon Forbidden West, while they did sell more on PlayStation 5, they were also available on PlayStation 4. So if you're a huge fan of Sony first party, you technically didn't have to rush out and buy a PS5 yet if you're playing games like God of War and Horizon, because you could still play those on your PS4. Spider-Man 2 is not going to have that option. That is current gen only. So that's going to probably have a huge hardware impact. And also, you have to keep in mind, it's not just third-party games that move hardware, it is also third-party. We just saw this with Hogwarts Legacy, where it moved a ton of hardware for PlayStation 5 by being a huge hit. We have a lot of games on the calendar this year, guys. We got titles like Jedi Survivor, titles like Diablo 4, as well as the third-party exclusives I mentioned like Final Fantasy 16 and Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth should also be part of this fiscal year because it's scheduled for this winter. Now that could be December, that could be January, that could be February, but it'll still be within the fiscal year. So the 25 million number is massive. Am I sitting here telling you it's a lock that they're going to be able to hit that? Not by any means, but it is possible. It's theoretically possible Sony might be able to pull this off. And if they do, it will be the biggest year ever in hardware for the PlayStation brand. So my final thoughts, my final wrap up of these PlayStation numbers. What does it mean to you if you're a PlayStation gamer? First of all, it has to be said, the PlayStation brand is absolutely on fire. It is doing tremendous at the moment. Hardware is the clear front runner in terms of the most impressive thing you're seeing on these charts, the thing that sticks out to you the most. We're talking about record quarters coming in and potentially record years coming in. Another thing I think is worth noting, online, I know that Jim Ryan gets a lot of pushback. He gets a lot of people making fun of him and teasing him online. The reality is Jim Ryan is a brilliant businessman, and that can clearly be seen and reflected in the performance of the PlayStation brand. Jim might be easy to tease, but the man knows what he's doing, and there's a reason he's gotten to the position he is, because that PlayStation brand right now is red hot. Now, if you want to really be super nitpicky and try and find some sort of negative, you got to pull something out. There's got to be a negative, right? I would say software could, theoretically be a little bit better. You would want to see software, growing year over year. However, as Sony noted, this is mostly due to third-party content, and I think we're going to see huge growth in software this coming fiscal year because, like I had mentioned, this extremely strong lineup of games that we're now seeing pour in. You've got titles like Street Fighter, Diablo, just tons and tons and tons of multi-platform games coming in. So I suspect, even if software is a little underwhelming for this last fiscal year, I think they're about to have huge growth anyways in that category, so it's not really the end of the world. Overall results are absolutely spectacular, particularly that hardware number. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the video. If so, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video if you haven't yet. It helps that YouTube algorithm. Follow me on Twitter. I am Benji-Sales on Twitter. And as always, everyone, stay safe, play some games. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.